"They will not sign," said Mr. Alderton, setting his leather case upon the hall table with the particular thud of a man who has exhausted every argument he owned. "I have tried 4 times, Your Grace. The Fenwick tenants will not put their names to it." Dominic Ashford, 7th Duke of Castlemore, stood at the window of his front hall and looked out at the frost-edged drive without answering immediately. That was his way, not because he was indifferent, but because he had learned, over 34 years of being the kind of man everyone watched for a reaction, that silence was a cleaner instrument than speech. He let Alderton's words sit in the room. He considered them as one considers a structural fault, not with alarm, but with the intention of understanding precisely where the load had failed. "Leave the documents on the table," Dominic said at last. "I will have someone look at them." Alderton blinked. Someone was not, in his experience, a word dukes used when they meant themselves. And at the edge of all that negotiation, standing at the far end of the hall with a mending basket over one arm and a ring of household keys at her hip, was Honora Vane. She was not dressed for notice. She wore a plain gray dress that had been let out at the hem precisely once, and that fit her with the particular exactness of clothing that has been maintained rather than replaced. Her dark hair was pinned without ornament. She held a piece of folded linen against the light from the narrow side window, checking a seam the way a surveyor checks a wall, thoroughly, without any need for approval. She had been standing there when Alderton arrived. She had, in the way of women in her position, been present for the entire conversation without being invited to be present for it. She set the linen back into the basket. She did not look at the Duke. She picked up her list from the shelf where she had placed it and noted that the 3rd footman had forgotten to oil the hall table hinges again, and that the east corridor carpet had developed a worn patch near the morning room door that would catch a heel before the month was out. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. Dominic watched her go. Mr. Alderton did not watch her go, because Mr. Alderton had not noticed her at all. That was the first thing Dominic noted about Honora Vane. The second thing he noted, 3 hours later, when he finally sat down with the documents Alderton had left, was that someone had already placed a folded piece of paper beneath the stack. Not on top, where a person drawing attention to their contribution would place it. Beneath. In the margin of that paper, in a precise and entirely unornamental hand, were 4 lines of analysis about the Fenwick tenancy dispute that were more structurally useful than anything Alderton had produced in 4 attempts. He read the 4 lines twice, then he read them a 3rd time. He did not say anything. He simply went to find her. Honora had been housekeeper at Castlemore for 6 years, a fact she did not particularly announce, and that the household had largely absorbed the way households absorb reliable things, by depending on them entirely while failing to remark upon them. Before that, she had been assistant housekeeper under Mrs. Gale, who had managed the estate for 11 years before her knees gave out. Before that, she had arrived at Castlemore at the age of 19, with a small trunk, a letter of reference from a man her late father had worked for, and the knowledge that she had precisely no other options that did not require her to become smaller than she intended to be. Her father had been a land agent, not a distinguished one, not the sort who attended the dinners or sat at the long end of the table, the sort who walked the property lines at dawn, who kept 3 sets of accounts so that nothing could be missed, who understood that the difference between a farm that survived a bad winter and one that did not was usually a question of anticipation rather than luck. He had taught her to read a map of land holdings before she could read a novel, and to balance a ledger before she could sew a straight seam, and to understand that the words of an agreement mattered more than the handshake that followed them. He had died when she was 16, leaving her in the care of an uncle who had very quickly identified her usefulness and installed her as unpaid administrator of his own modest estate, while he attended to what he called his interests. She had managed the Vane estate, such as it was, for 3 years. She had kept the books, negotiated with the wool merchant who came in October, arranged the tenant repairs in the spring, handled the creditors her uncle's interests tended to generate, and done all of this without a title, without pay beyond room and board, and without a single person in the household who considered her work worth naming. Her uncle called her a capable girl. His friends called her the mouse who kept the clocks wound. She called herself, privately, a person who was not going to become less than she was, because no one else had gotten around to measuring her correctly. She had kept one of her father's account books. She carried it with her when she left her uncle's house at 19 with the small trunk and the letter of reference. She had not left because of a dramatic moment of rebellion. She had left because she had calculated, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, that she would run out of productive work on the Vane estate within 18 months, and that her uncle would then have no particular use for her, and a great deal of use for her to marry someone who would take her off his hands. She had preferred Castlemore. She had managed crises before breakfast for 6 years. She could manage a household. The thing she had not anticipated was that Castlemore was in considerably worse shape than it appeared. Not structurally. The house itself was solid, built in the older style with walls that would outlast everyone currently living in them. But the estate's arrangements with its tenant farms had been handled, in the years before she arrived, with the particular carelessness of people who believed that arrangements did not need to be written down, because everyone understood them perfectly. Everyone, it turned out, understood them differently. The Fenwick tenancy, 7 farms, the largest on the eastern edge of the estate, had been operating for 11 years under an agreement that existed in 3 different versions, none of which had ever been signed. Honora had discovered this in her 2nd month. She had gone to the estate records to locate the Fenwick documents because a question of drainage maintenance had come up, and she had found, with the specific sensation of a person who has opened a box and discovered it contains considerably more than a box should, that the drafts accumulated by 4 different solicitors over 11 years had never been reconciled. 2 of them allocated the cost of fence repairs to the estate. 1 allocated it to the tenants. The 4th said nothing about fences at all. She had spent a Sunday afternoon, her own time, writing out a clear comparison of all 4 versions, noting the material differences, and annotating the points that would require either clarification or legal reconciliation. She had given this to the previous housekeeper, Mrs. Gale, who had taken it upstairs to the estate manager, Mr. Holt, who had thanked her for it and put it in a drawer. 4 years later, Mr. Holt left. The drawer was cleaned out. The Fenwick tenants, who had been quietly managing under the assumption that the fence repairs were the estate's responsibility, received an invoice from Alderton's office for 14 years of accumulated maintenance costs. They did not sign the new agreement. They were not going to sign any agreement that began by billing them for something they had never agreed to pay. This was what the 4 lines in Honora's note said, precisely, with a reference to the year the 3rd draft had been written, and a figure representing the total being contested, £42, 7 shillings. Not a catastrophic sum. Catastrophic enough. She was in the linen room when Dominic found her, folding a stack of pillowcases with the concentration of someone who finds methodical work useful for thinking. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she acknowledged him, not because she had not heard him arrive, but because she was finishing the fold, and because she had learned, over 6 years, that the completion of one's work was not a thing to be set aside merely because a more important person had appeared in the doorway. "The note under the documents," he said, "that was yours." "Yes, Your Grace. You have read all 4 versions of the Fenwick agreement." "I have." She set the pillowcase on the stack. "I read them 4 years ago. I gave a summary to Mr. Holt." There was a pause. He studied her in the way he had looked at her in the hall, not the way men in his position usually looked at women in hers, which was to say, not through her. This was the measuring attention of a person encountering something they have not categorized yet. "What would you do with it?" he said. She did not answer immediately. She was not performing consideration. She was actually considering, which looked like the same thing, but was not. "I would not send a solicitor," she said. "The Fenwicks have already had 4 solicitors. Every time one arrives, they understand it as a threat. I would go to them directly, not with a new agreement, with the old invoices. Show them the £42, show them exactly how it was calculated, then ask them which version of the agreement they were working from when they made those repairs." He looked at her steadily, and if they were working from the version that made it their cost, then the £42 is fair, and I would tell them so directly, and give them a payment schedule. But they are not working from that version. They are working from the 3rd draft, which has the estate paying for fence maintenance, because that is the one that was handed to Thomas Fenwick's father in 1801, and that he still has in his parlor desk. Another pause. It was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone recalibrating. "How do you know what he has in his parlor desk?" Dominic said. "Because he told Mrs. Fenwick about it last November, when she came to settle the quarterly account at the house. And Mrs. Fenwick told me when I gave her tea." She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like surprise meaning anything beyond itself, but something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like a dial turned one position, and she noted it the way she noted everything, without displaying the noting. He was not a man who came from easy circumstances, which was a thing people forgot about dukes. He had inherited at 26, 8 years ago, when his father died, leaving an estate that had been very competently mismanaged for 15 years by a man who had been very competent at appearing to manage it. The debts were not impossible. The trust in the estate's management had been. He had spent 3 years doing nothing but reading his own accounts and discovering, one document at a time, what had been obscured from him. He had done this alone, largely, because the alternative was to trust people who had already demonstrated that trust was not warranted. He had hired Alderton because Alderton was thorough. Alderton was thorough. He was also, Dominic had been noticing for some time now, thorough in the way of a man who knew very well how to document problems and considerably less well how to solve them. He had known about Honora Vane in the way one knows about furniture, by its presence and function, not by any particular examination. She was the housekeeper. The house ran. The connection between these two facts had been, until approximately 4 hours ago, something he had simply not examined. He had walked to the linen room in the expectation of asking her about the note. What he had discovered instead was something he had not expected, a woman who knew more about the Fenwick situation than his solicitor, who had known it for 4 years, who had done the analysis in her own time without being asked, and who had placed it under, rather than on top of the documents for reasons he found himself thinking about, with more attention than the documents themselves. He stood outside the linen room door after she returned to her work, and he went back to the hall. He stood there for approximately 30 seconds, which was a long time for a man who moved through his own house as though every moment were already scheduled. Then he made a decision. She was not going to discover it for another 3 days, because he did not announce decisions. He made them, and held them, and waited to see whether they were correct. The Castlemore estate ran on a set of rhythms that Honora had, over 6 years, largely set herself. The kitchen was managed by Mrs. Bright, who had been there for 20 years and who regarded any change to her menus as a personal attack on her dignity. The gardens were kept by old Parsons, who spoke primarily in monosyllables and who communicated displeasure through the placement of things. A spade leaned against the wrong wall, a pot set out of its usual order. The 3 footmen were young, trainable, and largely reliable so long as someone remembered to tell them things twice. The laundry maid, Bess, had just turned 17 and was still learning that water temperature was not a suggestion. And then there was Clara Webb. Clara had come to Castlemore 8 months before as a lady's maid, which was a somewhat elevated title for a household that had no lady requiring maid service. In practice, she had become the closest thing Honora had to appear in the house, which was a condition both of them arrived at without quite intending to. Clara was 23, direct-spoken in a way that was sometimes inconvenient and always useful, and she had the specific quality of seeing things clearly and having opinions about what she saw. She had opinions about the Fenwick situation. "Alderton's been there 4 times, Clara said, sitting across from Honora at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, while Honora worked through the week's accounts. And every time he goes, the Fenwicks come back angrier. If a thing isn't working, you try a different thing." "Yes," said Honora, not looking up from the column she was adding. "You should go yourself. Mr. Alderton would consider that an overstep." Clara made a sound that communicated her opinion of Mr. Alderton's considerations precisely. "Mr. Alderton has had 4 tries. His Grace does not seem satisfied with the results." Honora set down her pen. She looked at the column, £42, 7 shillings, sitting at the bottom of a page as neatly as a problem she had been looking at for 4 years. She picked up the pen again. "His Grace will make his own decisions," she said. He did, as it happened, make his own decision. That was what she discovered 3 days later, when he appeared at the door of the housekeeper's room, where she was reviewing the quarterly household accounts, and said, without preamble, "I would like you to come to the Fenwick farm with me on Friday." She looked up from the accounts. She kept her expression entirely neutral. "Your Grace, you will bring the original invoices. I will bring the third draft." He paused. "I assume you know where the third draft is. Third drawer of the estate manager's cabinet, left side, behind the 1802 drainage reports." He looked at her with that same measuring attention. It was not, she had begun to understand, dismissive. It was the particular attention of a person who finds something they did not know to expect. "Friday," he said, "after breakfast." She returned to the accounts. After he left, she pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the desk, not from agitation, but from something she was not going to name yet. She had managed households and accounts and creditors and difficult people for 6 years. She could manage Friday. The drive to the Fenwick farm took 40 minutes. The Duke rode. Honora was conveyed in the smaller carriage with the documents case, and a tin of Mrs. Bright's shortbread, which had been her own addition to the morning's preparations, and which Dominic had looked at, when it was loaded, with an expression somewhere between curiosity and recalibration. "Mrs. Fenwick will not sign anything," Honora had said, by way of explanation, "without being offered tea. And if she is going to offer tea, she will want to offer something with it, and if we arrive with something already, she won't feel she has come up short." He had looked at the tin for another moment. Then he had said, "How long have you known Mrs. Fenwick?" 6 years, said Honora. "She is particular about her kitchen." Thomas Fenwick was 51, broad-shouldered, and had the expression of a man who had been bracing himself for a fight since approximately November. He met them at the gate of the farmyard with his hands at his sides and a very precise blankness on his face that was not quite hostility and was not quite welcome. His wife stood in the door of the farmhouse behind him, her arms folded, watching. What happened over the following 3 hours was not, strictly speaking, remarkable to anyone observing it from the outside. There was tea, there was shortbread, there were documents laid on a kitchen table. There were voices, some of them raised briefly, and some of them not. And there were long silences, and the particular sound of figures being read aloud from a piece of paper, and compared to other figures on another piece of paper. And at the end of it all, there was a question asked by Honora. "Which version did your father give you, Mr. Fenwick? May I see it?" And Thomas Fenwick's expression changed like weather turning, and he went to the parlor and came back with a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had begun to go soft at the edges. It was the third draft. It was unmistakably the third draft. "The £42 was not your liability," Honora said, in the same tone she used for household accounts. Clear, precise, without apology and without performance. "The fourth draft was prepared without reference to this version. I believe this was an error by the estate, and I believe it should be acknowledged as such." She looked at Dominic. He met her eyes. He said, "It was an error by the estate. The sum will be struck from your account." The silence in the Fenwick kitchen lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Then Mrs. Fenwick, who had not spoken since the initial offers of tea and shortbread, said, "Well, let us have another cup then." The new agreement was signed by 3 of the 7 Fenwick farms before they left, with the understanding that the remaining 4 would sign within the fortnight. Thomas Fenwick shook Dominic's hand at the gate. He also, and this was not a thing Honora had anticipated, shook hers. She did not display the noting. She was still thinking about it in the carriage on the way back, the documents case balanced on the seat beside her, and the afternoon light coming through the carriage window at the particular angle that makes dust visible in the air. She had negotiated with merchants and creditors and difficult tenants before. She had produced correct analyses and given them to people who put them in drawers. She had been in rooms where her competence was used, and her presence was forgotten within the hour. Thomas Fenwick had shaken her hand. He had not looked through her. He had looked at her. She picked up her list from the document case and noted that the east corridor carpet still needed seeing to, and that she should write to the draper in town before the week was out. Back at Castlemore, the household had its own weather. Lady Alderton, the solicitor's wife, who had arrived that morning for a social call that had extended itself well past its natural life expectancy, was installed in the drawing room with Miss Euphemia Crane, who was 22, and the niece of Lord Crane of Devizes, and who had been visiting the county for 6 weeks in the company of her mother, who had made no effort to conceal that the visit's purpose was connected to the unmarried Duke of Castlemore. Miss Crane was acknowledged by general consensus to be the more beautiful, the better credentialed, and the more socially fitted candidate for the position of Duchess, a position that everyone agreed existed and that Dominic had given no sign of filling. She was also, as Honora had noted without particular pleasure, the person most likely to sit in the drawing room at Castlemore and look exactly as though she already belonged there. "You have been out with the housekeeper," said Miss Crane, when Dominic appeared briefly in the drawing room doorway on his way to the study. She smiled as she said it, the specific smile of someone who is naming a thing they consider mildly absurd and wish to establish as common ground. "I have been out to the Fenwick farm," Dominic said. "The tenancy agreement has been resolved." "Oh, marvelous." She adjusted the fall of her skirt with one elegant hand. "Alderton will be pleased." Alderton was unsuccessful, Dominic said. Miss Vane was not. He was already turning away when he said it, which meant he did not see Miss Crane's smile lose approximately 8% of its warmth. But Lady Alderton saw it, and Honora, who was passing the drawing room door with the document case, heard every word and did not stop walking. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like defense. But she thought about it anyway, that evening, when the house was quiet and she was sitting at the small desk in her room, the accounts open in front of her, and the fire burning low. He had said it without inflection, without ceremony, without any apparent intention of making a point. He had simply named what had occurred. She was not going to make more of that than it was. She was, however, going to note it accurately. The elder Mr. Whitmore found her the following morning. He was 68, and he had been the Castlemore family's private financial advisor since before Dominic was born. He was a compact, carefully dressed man, with a habit of standing very still when he was thinking, and of saying considerably less than he knew. He had been present at the estate during the previous Duke's mismanagement, a fact he never discussed, and that had produced in him, Honora suspected, a permanent vigilance about numbers that were not adding up. He found her in the estate room, where she was cross-referencing the Fenwick invoices against the estate accounts for the past 11 years to establish a clean record before the formal reconciliation. He stood in the doorway for a moment, which was his way. He never entered a room before he understood what was happening in it. "Miss Vane," he said, "I wonder if I might look at what you are doing." She turned the account book toward him. He sat down, uninvited but without presumption, and looked at the page for a long time. "You've gone back to 1803, he said. "The original discrepancy starts there. The first draft was 1801, but the first repair invoice appears in 1803, and the estate paid it at that time without dispute, which establishes the precedent." He looked up at her. His expression was the particular expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to see something done correctly. "His Grace said you resolved the Fenwick matter," he said. "His Grace resolved it. I provided the documents." "His Grace," said Mr. Whitmore, "is a man who can do a great deal with the right documents." He paused. "Where did you train?" She told him about her father. Not all of it. The relevant portion. The account books, the land agent's ledgers, the 3 years at her uncle's estate. He listened without interruption, which was the sort of listening that cost something. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The estate was in poor condition when you arrived," he said. "It had been better managed than it appeared," she said carefully. "Some of the problems were structural, and some were procedural. The procedural ones were more straightforward." Whitmore looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. "Yes," he said, "that is one way to put it." He stood, straightening his coat with the habitual care of a man who takes precision seriously in all things. "I should like to see the full Fenwick reconciliation when you have finished it. If I may." "Of course," she said. He left. Honora returned to the account book. She noted, without displaying the noting, that she had just been spoken to by the most senior financial authority in the Castlemore household, as though her opinion was a thing worth having. She pressed one hand briefly to the page, and then went on. The difficulty with the weeks that followed was not the work. The work was considerable. The full Fenwick reconciliation took 9 days, and while she was doing it, the East Corridor carpet had to be seen to, and the draper in town needed 2 letters before he acknowledged the order, and Bess managed to shrink the second-best tablecloth in a way that required diplomatic management of Mrs. Bright's feelings. But the work she could manage. The work she had always been able to manage. The difficulty was Dominic. Not anything specific he did. Nothing she could have pointed to as a cause. It was more like the way a room's acoustics change when the furniture is rearranged. The same walls, the same dimensions, but the sound of everything moving through them differently. He had begun to come to the estate room in the evenings. Not every evening. 3 evenings in 7, perhaps, in the first week. He would sit at the larger desk with his own correspondence, and she would sit at the smaller one with the reconciliation accounts, and they would work in the same room without conversation for periods of time that she found, increasingly, she was not marking the end of with any particular relief. He read quickly and wrote with a neat, contained hand. He had the habit of setting aside a paper by placing it precisely parallel to the edge of the desk, which told her something about how he organized his own thinking. He did not ask her questions during these sessions. Occasionally he would look at something she had said earlier in the day about the accounts and find a discrepancy she hadn't mentioned yet, not because she had missed it, but because she had been holding it to verify before raising it, and he would set the relevant page in front of her without comment, and she would note where she was in the reconciliation and turn her attention to the discrepancy. They worked like 2 mechanisms that had been built separately and had, over time, found that their timing was compatible. On the 4th evening, she arrived at the estate room to find that he had already lit the lamp on the smaller desk as well as his own. She sat down. She opened the account book. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because what the lit lamp said was already precise and sufficient. She noted that it had been 68 weeks since she had last felt entirely comfortable in her own usefulness, and that she was now comfortable in a way that was somewhat different from usefulness. She picked up her pen and returned to the reconciliation. The confrontation, when it came, did not come from Miss Crane, which was what Honora had been expecting. It came from Lord Alderton, who arrived at Castlemore one afternoon with a proposition so politely framed that it took her approximately 4 paragraphs to understand it was a dismissal. He sat in the morning room, hat balanced on his knee, and explained that it had come to his attention, in his capacity as the Duke's legal adviser, that the housekeeper's involvement in the Fenwick matter had created a somewhat irregular precedent, that there were concerns, among several parties with long connections to the estate, that the expansion of certain domestic roles into matters properly belonging to the legal and administrative management of the estate was a thing that might cause difficulties, that he was sure Miss Vane understood the delicacy of the situation. Honora sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap. She allowed him to finish. She kept her expression precisely where it was. "I have managed the domestic accounts of this estate for 6 years," she said when he was done. "I have managed the tenancy documentation for 4 years, after identifying a significant discrepancy that had been present in the estate records when I arrived. The Fenwick matter was resolved through reference to original documents, accurate arithmetic, and a conversation with Mrs. Fenwick that established which version of the agreement the family had been working from. I do not believe any of that constitutes an irregular precedent. If His Grace wishes to discuss the limits of my role, I would welcome that conversation directly." She did not raise her voice. She did not change her expression. She named exactly what she had done and sat with it. Alderton's mouth opened and then closed. "Miss Vane, I am not suggesting—" "I believe you are," she said pleasantly. "I believe you are suggesting that my involvement in the Fenwick matter was an overreach, and that it might be better managed in future if I returned to linen inventories and kitchen accounts. I am suggesting that the Fenwick matter was not resolved by overreach but by accurate documentation, and that the documentation was accurate because I have been reading this estate's records for 6 years and no one else has been reading them as thoroughly." She picked up the account book from the table beside her. "Is there anything specific in my work you would like to address?" Alderton left without having addressed anything specific. Clara Webb appeared in the doorway of the housekeeper's room, 12 minutes later, with an expression of barely contained satisfaction. Old Parsons heard him drive away from the garden gate. He said the wheels were going rather fast. Mr. Alderton had other appointments, Honora said. Did he? Presumably. Clara looked at her with the particular directness that was her way. You know what you did. I answered his questions. You told him to go back to his box. Clara sat down, uninvited and without the least apology for it. Do you know that Mrs. Bright heard you through the morning room door, and has been telling everyone in the kitchen that you ought to be running the whole county? Honora picked up her list. She had managed creditors and solicitors and difficult uncles. She could manage the opinion of Mrs. Bright's kitchen. But she noted it. She noted all of it, including the fact that when she returned to the estate room that evening, and Dominic was already at the larger desk, he looked at her when she came in and said, without preamble, Alderton came to see you. It was not a question. He did, she said. I know what he said. She sat down. She opened the account book. His Grace need not concern himself with it. I concern myself with what happens in my house, Dominic said quietly. She looked at him across the room. He was watching her with that measuring attention that had become, over the past weeks, something she recognized as particular to her, something he did not spend on anyone else in the same way. She was not going to assume anything from that, but she was, in the interest of accuracy, going to note it precisely. The reconciliation is nearly finished, she said. I should have the clean accounts ready for Mr. Whitmore by Thursday. He nodded. He returned to his correspondence. She returned to the accounts. The lamp on her desk burned steadily, and the house outside was quiet with the particular quiet of late November, and she thought, for a moment, about the fact that she was warm. Then she picked up her pen and went on. Miss Crane's departure from the county happened quietly, the following week, in the way of things that do not succeed without obvious catastrophe, but simply cease to have forward motion. Her mother wrote a polite note to Castlemore saying that Euphemia's health required the sea air, and that they were removing to Brighton for the winter. It was the kind of note that told everyone precisely everything. Honora noted it, and noted that she was not permitting herself a feeling about it, and noted that the not permitting was itself a data point. It was Whitmore who made things clear, in the end, not with drama, but with the specific clarity of a man who deals in facts. He came to her on a Thursday morning, with the full Fenwick reconciliation she had given him, now annotated in his own hand, and with a second document she had not prepared. I have taken the liberty, he said, sitting down at the estate room table, with the ease of someone who had decided on a thing and was not uncertain about it, of presenting your analysis to the full investor group for the estate. He set the document in front of her, not as the housekeeper's analysis, as the estate analyst's analysis. I did not specify a name. I wanted to see what the document would do on its own merits before I attached a name to it. She looked at the document. It had come back with annotations from 6 different hands, and all 6 were the marks of men working through an argument they found credible. The Fenwick reconciliation, Whitmore said, has prompted 3 other tenant families to come forward with queries about their own agreements. All 3 reference earlier drafts that were superseded without their knowledge. He looked at her steadily. His Grace is aware of this. He asked me to tell you that he would like your assessment of the 3 new queries, in whatever form you find most useful. She looked at the document for a moment longer. How many years of records would you like me to go back? She said. As far as you think necessary. She nodded. She picked up her pen. Whitmore did not leave immediately. He sat for a moment longer, with the comfortable unhurriedness of a man who has one more thing to say and is choosing his moment. My father, he said, was also a land agent. I grew up reading his ledgers. He paused. It is not a common background for a financial advisor, but it is, I have found, a useful one. She looked at him. He met her eyes with the particular expression of someone who sees you clearly and has decided to say so. She said, I kept my father's account book. I know, he said. I saw it in the 3rd drawer, when I was looking for the 1802 drainage reports. He stood up, straightening his coat. and left her to her work. She put her hand flat on the desk for a moment. She was not going to make anything excessive out of being understood, but the weight of it was real, and she let herself feel the weight without diminishing it. Then she opened the first of the 3 new tenant files and began to read. The Investor Council met at Castlemore on the 14th of December. There were 11 of them, 8 men of business or title, 2 family solicitors, and Lord Alderton himself, who sat at the far end of the long table in the dining room, with the expression of a man who has been told to attend something he had not expected to attend, and who was not certain he approved of his own attendance. Dominic sat at the head. Whitmore sat to his right. The documents were arranged in 3 sets: the Fenwick reconciliation, the 3 new tenant analyses, and a 4th document that Honora had not been told about until that morning, a full structural review of the estate's tenancy agreements, going back 17 years, that she had prepared for Whitmore 3 days earlier as a supporting document for the 3 new cases. She had not expected to be in the room. She was in the room because Dominic had said, "At breakfast, I would like you to present the 3 cases yourself. Whitmore will introduce the documents. You will answer questions." She had looked at him across the breakfast table. He had been cutting a piece of toast with the contained precision of a man who makes decisions and holds them. "Alderton will object," she said. "Alderton has had 4 attempts at the Fenwick matter, and has not resolved one of the 3 new cases in the 6 weeks since they were raised. He may object." He looked up at her. "I do not intend to withdraw the request." She thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely, not quickly. "I will need an hour this morning to prepare the presentation order," she said. "You have it," he said. She straightened her spine and went to work. The room was arranged for formality and money, which were, in her experience, nearly the same thing. Whitmore introduced the documents with the precision of a man who had been doing this for 30 years, and who had decided that precision was a form of respect. Alderton's expression progressed, over the course of the introduction, from studied neutrality to the particular tightness of a man who is watching something he had hoped to prevent unfold without his consent. Then Honora stood up. She was still wearing her gray dress, because she had not been told until that morning, and had not had occasion to change. She stood at the end of the table with the 3 case files and the structural review in front of her, and she looked at 11 men who represented the financial oversight of an estate she had been managing, in whole or in part, for 6 years without credit, acknowledgement, or title. She was not going to argue. She was not going to plead. She was going to present. "The Fenwick matter," she said, "arose from an error in documentation that has a specific origin. I would like to show you that origin, because understanding it is what will prevent the same error in the other 3 cases." She laid the first document open on the table and turned it so the room could see it. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She worked through the first case in 14 minutes. The original draft, the revised draft, the superseding draft that was never communicated to the tenant family, the 11 years of invoices that had accumulated against a liability the family had not known was contested. She was precise about the figures, and about the dates, and about the specific procedural failure, which was not malice but the particular neglect of people who believed that arrangements did not need to be written down, because everyone understood them perfectly. She did not editorialize. She let the documents speak. The second case took 11 minutes. The third, 9. By the third case, 2 of the 8 men of business were making notes. One of them, a Mr. Hatfield, who had the aspect of someone who manages a great deal of money very quietly, had pulled the structural review toward him and was working through it with the attention of a person who has encountered a document that is doing exactly what a document should do. When she finished, the room was not, as she had learned not to expect, immediately converted. There was a moment of the particular suspended silence that follows something being made undeniable. Then Alderton said, "The analysis is thorough, but I would suggest that—" "Mr. Alderton," said Dominic, from the head of the table. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Alderton stopped. "Miss Vane has presented 17 years of documented estate records, 3 specific case analyses, and a structural review that identifies the procedural failure responsible for all three disputes. Is there an error in the figures? A pause. No, Alderton said. Is there a document she has misread? Another pause. Longer. No. Then I suggest we turn to the question of resolution. The session lasted another 90 minutes. By the end of it, all three tenant cases had been provisionally resolved on terms the Fenwick resolution had established as precedent, and Mr. Hatfield had asked, with the specific directness of a man who does not waste questions, whether the estate had a formal estate analyst on its staff, or whether the structural review had been prepared by someone else. Whitmore had opened his mouth to answer. Dominic had answered first. The structural review was prepared by Miss Vane, he said, who has been managing the estate's documentation for 6 years. I am considering formalizing that role. The room absorbed this. Hatfield nodded, with the economical approval of someone who finds a satisfactory answer. Two of the others exchanged a glance that was not hostile so much as recalibrating. Alderton looked at the table. Dominic stood. The session was over. He did not look at her immediately. He gathered his papers, spoke briefly to Whitmore, and then, when the room had begun to empty, turned and looked directly at her with an expression she had not seen before, something quieter than satisfaction, something that had been building in him, she understood suddenly, for considerably longer than that morning. Well done, he said. It was exactly 2 words, said without ornamentation. She picked up her files. She did not trust herself to say more than, "Thank you, Your Grace." But her hands were completely steady, and that was its own answer. Lord Alderton came to find her as the council members were leaving through the front hall. He was not a cruel man, she had always known. He was a thorough one, who had not, until that afternoon, had access to accurate documentation. He stopped in the doorway of the estate room where she was ordering the case files for return to the cabinet, and he stood there for a moment with the particular stillness of a man who has something to say and is not certain how to say it correctly. I had not, he said carefully, understood the full extent of the documentation. He paused. The 1803 precedent was not in anything I was given. No, she said. It was in the 3rd drawer. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, but acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a man who has been wrong about the location of a fact and is choosing to say so. I see, he said. He left. She returned to the files. She had managed uncles and creditors, and drawn out negotiations and solicitors, who were thorough in the wrong direction. She had managed all of it, for years, without anyone much noting the managing. She picked up her list. She straightened her spine. She went on. What she did not expect, that evening, was the garden. She had gone out at dusk for no particular reason, except that she needed the cold air and the particular quality of light that came just before dark in December, when the sky was the color of iron and the frost had settled on the garden paths, and everything was very still and very clear. She walked along the east path, which ran between the kitchen garden wall and the old orchard, and she was thinking about nothing more specific than the 3 case files, and the route to the drapers, and whether Bess had remembered to lay the right fires, which was the way her mind moved when it was resting. She heard him on the gravel behind her before she saw him. He walked with a specific rhythm, not heavy, but deliberate. She did not turn immediately. You did not need to accompany me, she said. I know, he said. He fell into step beside her. They walked for a moment in the silence that had, by now, become a thing she recognized as theirs. Not empty but inhabited. The frost made the gravel sharper underfoot, and the air had the smell of wood smoke from the chimneys, and the last light was going very fast. Hatfield spoke to me before he left, Dominic said. He said the structural review was the clearest estate documentation he had seen in 30 years of advising properties. He paused. He asked me to ensure the person who prepared it was properly compensated. She kept walking. I trust His Grace will make whatever arrangements he considers appropriate. Honora, he said. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Vane, not a formal address. Her name, said with the particular exactness of something he had been considering for some time. She turned and looked at him. The last light was on his face, which was an unusual thing. He was not, generally, a man whose expression was easily read, but in that moment, she could read it quite clearly. "I need to tell you something," he said, "which I should perhaps have said sooner, but which I was not certain of sooner, and I do not say things I am not certain of." She waited. She was entirely still. "I have been watching you for 6 weeks," he said, not watching as a man who is uncertain of what he is looking at. Watching as a man who knows precisely what he is looking at and is determining what he intends to do about it. He looked at her directly. "I am not proposing because it is convenient, or because it serves the estate's requirements, or because Miss Crane's mother has removed to Brighton. I am proposing because you are the most operationally extraordinary person I have encountered in 8 years of trying to understand how to manage what I was given, and because I have been in that estate room every evening for 6 weeks, and the evenings when I am not in that room have been, I find, less useful in every respect. And because you straightened the collar of my coat 3 days ago, and told me it had been sitting wrong for 40 minutes, and no one has told me anything that direct or that useful in a very long time." She was quiet. She thought about it. Completely, not quickly. She thought about her father's account book in the 3rd drawer. She thought about Thomas Fenwick shaking her hand. She thought about the lamp on the smaller desk, already lit when she arrived. She thought about the specific quality of the evenings in that room, and the way the 2 desks were arranged, and the fact that she had stopped noting the end of those evenings with any particular relief. And she thought about what it meant that he was a man who said things he was certain of, and not things he wasn't. "I accept," she said, "with one condition." He waited. "The condition is that you tell me the next time something is sitting wrong. With the accounts, with the tenancy arrangements, with anything. Before it has been sitting wrong for 11 years. She paused. 4 drafts is too many. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was the architecture of one. "Agreed," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she offered him her hand. Not in ceremony, but in the way of 2 people who have been working in the same room for 6 weeks, and have understood each other very well. He took it. He held it for a moment, with the same deliberateness with which he did everything, and then he turned it over and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, which was not gloved because she had not expected to go outside that evening. The cold air and the weight of it, and the smell of wood smoke were all precise and real. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She had known that since a Tuesday afternoon in November in her uncle's house, and she knew it now, standing on a frost-edged path in December, in a garden that was, she was beginning to understand, going to be hers. She picked up his free hand and corrected the lie of his cuff, which had been twisted since morning. "That," he said, "has been sitting wrong since breakfast." "Yes," she said. "I noticed." The wedding was quiet, which suited both of them, and took place in the Castlemore Chapel on the 5th of March, a Tuesday, in the presence of Mr. Whitmore, Clara Webb, old Parsons, Mrs. Bright, and 11 of the 12 tenant families of the Castlemore estate, who came because they had been told they were welcome, and because, as Thomas Fenwick said afterward, it seemed the right sort of occasion for people who had a stake in how the estate was managed to attend. Alderton was there. He stood toward the back with the particular expression of a man who has recalibrated slowly and is not quite finished recalibrating, but who has at least arrived, which counted for something. Lord Crane sent a note from London expressing his regrets and his congratulations in equal and not entirely convincing measure. Miss Crane sent nothing, which was probably, Honora thought, the correct response to the situation. Clara Webb cried, which she would have disputed if challenged, and Whitmore stood straight and still and looked at the 2 of them in front of the chapel, with the expression of a man who has seen a correct calculation proven true. They built the life the way they built everything else, deliberately, with attention to the specifics, and with a clear-eyed understanding of where the load was carried and by whom. Dominic managed the formal estate governance and the investor relationships and the correspondence with Parliament, which was considerable. Honora managed the structural documentation, the tenancy analysis, and the household, and, increasingly, the operational decisions that had previously been filtered through 3 unnecessary intermediaries before reaching anyone who understood them. Within 2 years of the wedding, all 12 Castlemore tenant families were operating under signed, reconciled agreements, prepared from original documentation. Mr. Hatfield referred 2 neighboring estates to Whitmore with the suggestion that they might benefit from similar work, and Whitmore, without quite asking permission, sent them copies of Honora's structural review template, annotated with the specific methodology she had developed for identifying the discrepancy between a draft and an operating assumption. By 1845, 4 neighboring estates had adopted what was referred to, in correspondence between their respective advisors, as the Castlemore method, though no correspondence named its author. Honora named it herself. Eventually, in the preface to a set of annotated guidance documents she prepared in her 38th year for the instruction of estate managers across the region. Not out of vanity, she had no particular interest in vanity, but because it was accurate, and because she had learned, over 20 years of doing work that was not credited, that precision extended to attribution as well as to accounts. Their son, James, was born in the winter of 1839, which was a hard winter but a good one inside the walls of Castlemore. He arrived in the world already a parent, large, dark-eyed, with his mother's particular intensity of attention and his father's habit of stillness, and secured, as the first son of the 7th Duke of Castlemore, the ducal succession in the way that the formal instruments required. He was named James Whitmore Ashford, the middle name chosen because Dominic had said, with the particular certainty of a man who had thought about it, that Whitmore had seen what he had not and had acted correctly, and that was worth a name. James grew up between the 2 desks in the estate room. He was, from approximately age 5, the sort of child who could not be left in any room without attempting to catalogue its contents, and who had views about the organization of account books that were, his mother noted with a precision she kept largely to herself, entirely correct. He escaped the crib at 4 in the morning twice a month until he was 3, at which point he discovered the estate room and simply appeared there instead, sitting in the large chair in front of the fire with the look of someone arriving at a destination. Dominic found him there the first time, at 5 in the morning, and stood in the doorway for a moment before he went to him, and the expression on his face was the expression Honora had seen in the garden in December, quieter than satisfaction, the kind of thing that does not need a name. She was already at the small desk. She had heard James leave the nursery and had come down herself, because the house was hers, and she knew every sound of it. She looked up at Dominic in the doorway. "He has been here for 20 minutes, she said. "He found the 1837 drainage report and has been looking at it with what I can only describe as professional interest." Dominic looked at the child, who was looking at the drainage report with the focused attention of someone who was getting something out of it. "He is 3, said Dominic. "He is," said Honora. "He will be interested in the Fenwick file by 5. He came and sat at the large desk. She returned to her work. James continued his assessment of the 1837 drainage report with the methodical satisfaction of someone engaged in a genuinely useful activity. The fire burned low, and then she put another piece of wood on it, and the room was warm, and outside the December frost was on the garden paths again, and Dominic watched her from across the room with the particular attention that had been, since the first evening he lit the lamp on the smaller desk, entirely her own. She knew he was watching. She had always known. She picked up her pen, and she went on.